Okay, so picture this. It's June 25th, 1950. Headlines around the world explode with the news North Korea has launched a surprise attack on South Korea.
Yeah, a huge event, instantly shaping global perceptions. And for U.S. leaders like Truman, this wasn't just some isolated border skirmish.
No, not at all.
They saw it as a chilling echo of, well, the aggressions of Hitler, Mussolini, Japan,
Right.
a Soviet-orchestrated move in their grand scheme for world domination.
Exactly. That Cold War fear was so real. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating for our listeners. You've been with us as we've explored all sorts of sources on the Korean War.
Yeah.
But in this one, we're going beyond that initial shock, peeling back the layers to reveal the incredibly complex set of events and decisions that fueled this conflict. We're poring over historical analyses, digging into declassified military reports, and even looking at broader overviews of the war.
Yeah, and the goal is to extract what's most important.
Mhm.
To give everyone listening a clearer understanding of how this pivotal war unfolded, the crucial turning points, and the long-lasting impacts that we still grapple with today.
Okay, so to really grasp all of this, we need to take a step back.
Yeah.
Way back, even before 1950.
Before the war even began.
Before the war even began. The seeds of this conflict were sown much earlier, starting with Japan's colonization of Korea.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're talking decades of brutal control. Then, after World War II, you have this almost, I don't know, almost haphazard decision by the U.S. and the Soviet Union to just divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel.
Almost like cutting it in half.
Yeah, literally cutting it in half. And what's so crucial to remember here is this division, it wasn't something that the Korean people themselves wanted.
No, not at all. They were yearning for independence.
Yeah, immediate independence. But instead, they got this.
What's interesting, too, is how differently the two occupying powers approached their zones.
Yeah.
Like in the South, the U.S. military government had these huge challenges just maintaining order.
Right.
They relied heavily on, well, individuals who had collaborated with the Japanese during the occupation.
Which had to cause some tension.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can imagine the resentment that brewed. And it really, you could argue, it undermined the legitimacy of that emerging South Korean state.
Yeah. And meanwhile, in the North, the Soviets were doing things completely differently.
Totally different approach. They instituted these sweeping political, social, and economic reforms. And get this, these changes often found support among the local population.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is key. And this difference in approach, well, it fueled a massive flow of refugees southward.
So you've got instability on top of instability.
Absolutely. Adding fuel to the fire in that American-occupied zone. And all of this really highlights the struggles to even get to a unified Korea in the first place.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, on paper, they were working towards this single Korean government. But come on. Their visions were fundamentally different. And you got those escalating Cold War tensions, right? Like trying to mix oil and water. Finding common ground was basically impossible. Even the trusteeship plan, which was supposed to be this temporary bridge to independence.
Right.
It collapsed because the Soviets refused to actually consult with anti-communist Koreans. Like, what are you even doing here?
Yeah, it's almost like they weren't even trying.
Yeah,
And that failure laid the groundwork for what came next. Two separate Koreas.
exactly.
In August 1948, the U.S. backs the creation of South Korea, the RK,
With Syngman Rhee as the leader.
Syngman Rhee at the helm. The Soviets then counter by establishing the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, the DPRK, under Kim Il-sung.
So you've got two Koreas,
Mm.
two completely opposing ideologies, two political systems, and, oh yeah, huge military imbalance.
Right.
I mean, North Korea had a significant military advantage right out of the gate.
They were ready.
Oh yeah, the Soviets had been providing them with modern weapons, training by Soviet advisors, even some who had fought in the Chinese Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they had a coordinated war plan too.
And the U.S.'s response?
Well, they intentionally limited South Korea's military capabilities. There was this concern that Syngman Rhee, who was very vocal about wanting reunification, might actually launch an attack first.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you've got North Korea with tanks, a developing air force. South Korea, on the other hand, had almost no heavy weaponry to match that.
It's crazy how these pieces were all falling into place. And then you have Kim Il-sung.
Oh, Kim Il-sung, constantly pushing for Stalin's approval to invade. This wasn't some impulsive decision either. He kept asking, kept getting denied.
Really?
Yeah. It wasn't until January 1950, after the communist victory in China and the Soviets developed the atomic bomb, that Stalin finally agreed. But there was a catch.
There's always a catch.
Mao Zedong in China also had to give the green light. So Kim Il-sung travels to Beijing, spends days trying to convince a very hesitant Mao.
Who wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea.
No, not at all. But in the end, with both Stalin and a reluctant Mao on board, the invasion was a go. And when it hit, man, it hit hard. June 25th, 1950. The North Korean People's Army just steamrolls through South Korea.
It was a blitzkrieg.
They captured something like 95% of the peninsula, pushing UN and South Korean forces all the way back to this tiny pocket in the southeast.
The Pusan perimeter.
The Pusan perimeter.
Mm.
And the U.S. 24th Infantry Division.
Yeah.
Decimated it. Daejeon, their commander, captured. It was a dire situation.
It was, and it really highlights how crucial the UN's involvement was. Truman sees this as Soviet aggression, goes straight to the UN Security Council.
Now, here's the thing. The Soviet Union could have vetoed any resolution.
Right.
But they were boycotting the council at the time because the UN wouldn't recognize the People's Republic of China.
But they weren't even there to stop it.
Nope. And that allowed the UN to pass resolutions calling for a ceasefire and authorizing member states to send military aid to South Korea. Boom. The United Nations Command is formed. General Douglas MacArthur is put in charge.
Talk about a turning point.
Yeah. But even with the UN involved, things were still incredibly tense within the Pusan perimeter. It was basically a desperate fight for survival for months.
You can imagine the pressure, and it's in this incredibly tense moment that MacArthur comes up with this, well, some would say crazy plan.
Oh yeah, Operation Chromite.
An amphibious landing at Incheon.
Deep behind enemy lines. Strategically a brilliant move. Take Incheon, cut off North Korean supply lines, and you're right there, next to Seoul, the South Korean capital.
Huge psychological victory.
Huge, but risky as hell. I mean, naval and marine commanders, the Joint Chiefs, they all had serious concerns.
What were they worried about?
Everything.
Yeah.
The insane tides in the Yellow Sea, the narrow channels approaching Incheon, landing in a heavily built-up city, having to scale seawalls, and on top of all that, MacArthur was committing most of his forces with very few reserves.
Wow.
It was a gamble.
And what happened?
Well, despite all the warnings, all the doubts, the Incheon landing launched on September 15th, 1950, and it was a stunning success. Complete surprise. They secured Wolmi Island, which controlled the harbor, and then came the landings at red and blue beaches.
Under fire.
Oh yeah, they faced enemy fire, those huge seawalls, but the resistance was lighter than expected. Yeah, in the operation, it just moved with incredible speed. Within days, Seoul was liberated, and the North Korean army was in full retreat back across the 38th parallel. I mean, Incheon is considered a brilliant, albeit risky, military operation.
A game changer for sure.
It totally shifted the course of the war. And that shift, it led to a major change in the UN's goals, too. At first, it was all about restoring the status quo, right?
Yeah.
Pushing North Korea back to its original borders. But after Incheon,
Things changed.
There was this new possibility, formalized in the National Security Council document NSC 81, cross the 38th parallel, and reunify Korea by force.
So they decided to push forward.
Yeah. So after retaking Seoul in late September 1950, the UN launches this huge offensive into North Korea. South Korean forces advance up the East Coast, U.S.-led forces up the West. And there was this feeling, that victory was in sight.
But then,
as the UN forces got deeper into North Korea, China started sending out warnings. And these weren't vague threats. They were very specific, very direct, communicated through their ambassador to India.
What were they saying?
They basically said if U.S. forces cross the 38th parallel, China will intervene.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And what was the response?
Well, the American command basically dismissed those warnings. They thought China was bluffing, too weak to get involved.
So they kept pushing forward.
Yeah. Even in that famous meeting at Wake Island in October 1950, MacArthur assures Truman, don't worry, China won't intervene. A huge miscalculation. Because just a few weeks later, the Chinese Communist Forces, the CCF, they start pouring across the Yalu River into North Korea.
They weren't bluffing.
Nope. And the initial engagements were brutal. The South Korean 6th Division gets ambushed, practically wiped out. Heavy attacks against the South Korean 2nd Corps and the U.S. I Corps. The UN forces realized very quickly that the war had just changed dramatically.
It's amazing how quickly things can shift in war.
It is. And one of the clearest examples of this shift, the Battle of Unsan, in early November 1950. The Chinese launched this massive attack against the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment. Horrific American casualties, organized U.S. units just disintegrating. It was
Wow.
a devastating blow, forcing the UN forces into a retreat. It was a major setback.
So what happened next?
Well, the UN forces regrouped, eventually stabilized the front line. But that initial optimism, that hope for quick reunification, it was gone,
Yeah.
replaced by this long, bloody stalemate. And then with the war stalled and disagreements about strategy growing, Truman makes the controversial decision to fire MacArthur.
In April 1951.
Yep. MacArthur had been publicly pushing to expand the war into China. Truman wasn't having it.
Which caused a whole other debate back home.
A huge controversy. And with the front lines basically frozen in place, the war shifted into this brutal period of trench warfare, almost like World War I all over again. Ceasefire negotiations started in July 1951 at Kaesong, but the fighting continued.
So they were talking peace while still at war.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Positional warfare dragged on for almost 2 more years.
So what finally brought this war to an end?
Well, a few things happened. Stalin died in 1953,
Okay.
and that might have shifted Soviet priorities. Maybe they were more willing to negotiate. All sides were feeling the pressure, the economic burdens, the massive casualties, and there was growing international pressure to end the fighting.
Everyone wanted peace.
Yeah. So finally, on July 27, 1953, the armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom. It stopped the fighting, but it wasn't a formal peace treaty.
So Korea remained divided.
Divided, pretty much along that same 38th parallel. And it's important to remember, Syngman Rhee, South Korea's president, he wasn't happy about this armistice.
Yeah.
It took a lot of convincing from the Eisenhower administration for him to accept it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Korean War, let's recap the main points.
Okay.
The war's origins, deeply entangled in Cold War tensions, and the forced division of Korea. We saw dramatic turns, the North Korean invasion, the Incheon landing, China's entry into the war,
Yeah.
and in the end, a brutal stalemate, an armistice that left Korea divided, a division that, as we know, still exists today.
And it's so important to consider the legacy of this conflict, how it continues to shape geopolitics. I mean, the divided peninsula is this constant reminder of the Cold War, a region of immense strategic importance.
And of course, we can't forget about North Korea today.
Right. Their unpredictable actions, their isolation, it's all connected to this unresolved history from the Korean War.
It's a powerful reminder that the past is never truly past. And it makes you wonder, what if things had been different? What if the U.S. had provided more military support to South Korea before the invasion? What if MacArthur had listened to those warnings about China?
Yeah.
Would the outcome have been different? These are the kind of questions that really get you thinking, and that's what we hope this deep dive has done. Encourage you to think critically about the Korean War, its complexities, and its enduring impacts. Go back to the sources we talk about, keep exploring, because there's always more to learn about this pivotal moment in history.